There's something quietly strange about luxury, isn't there? Something we don't often talk about, but that we all somehow understand. If you've ever slipped on an expensive pair of shoes and felt that immediate pinch, that slight wrongness in the arch, or if you've ever worn a beautifully tailored jacket that looked perfect but made you aware of your shoulders in a way you'd never been before, then you know what I mean. Luxury fashion, real luxury fashion, the kind that carries weight and history and prestige, is almost never designed with your comfort in mind. And that's not an accident. It's not a flaw in the system. It's the system itself. Think about it for a moment. Really think about it. The most expensive, most coveted garments in the world, the ones that appear on runways in Paris and Milan, the ones that are archived in museums and worn by people whose lives seem impossibly remote from our own. These pieces are rarely soft. They're rarely forgiving. They don't move with you the way a cotton t-shirt moves with you. They don't yield. And there's a reason for that. A reason that goes back centuries. Back to a time when clothing wasn't about ease at all, but about something else entirely. Something to do with power and distance and the performance of a life that exists above the ordinary concerns of the body. Luxury has always been about separation. Not just financial separation, though, that's certainly part of it, but a kind of physical, tangible separation from the lives that most people live. And discomfort, strangely enough, is one of the oldest and most reliable markers of that separation. When you think about the history of fashion, you start to notice that the people who wore the most elaborate, the most expensive, the most admired clothing were also the people who were most visibly constrained by it. Their bodies were shaped and reshaped, compressed and extended, elevated and immobilized. And all of this discomfort was a signal. It said, very clearly, I do not work with my hands. I do not need to move quickly. I do not need to bend or reach or run. My life is not like yours. Let's start, perhaps, with the corset. Because the corset is one of those garments that everyone knows about, at least in theory, but that we don't always sit with long enough to really understand. The corset, particularly in the 18th and 19th centuries, was a foundational garment for women of a certain class. It wasn't optional. It was the structure upon which everything else was built. And it did extraordinary things to the body. It compressed the waist, sometimes to alarming degrees. It pushed the bust upward and forward. It made the spine very straight, almost unnaturally straight, and it made certain movements nearly impossible. You couldn't slump in a corset. You couldn't curl up comfortably. You couldn't take a full, deep breath in the way you can when your ribs are unrestricted. The corset was, in many ways, a kind of beautiful prison. But here's the thing. The discomfort of the corset wasn't incidental. It was the point. A woman who wore a tightly laced corset was advertising, whether she meant to or not, that she didn't need to do physical labor. Her body was decorative. Her body was for display. The very fact that she could endure the discomfort, that she could move through the world in such a constrained state, was proof of her status. Because if you had to work, if you had to clean or cook or carry or bend over a washboard or in a field, you simply couldn't wear a corset like that. Your body couldn't afford to be that rigid. So the corset became a marker, a visible sign that said, I belong to a different kind of life. And this idea, this connection between discomfort and status, It shows up again and again throughout fashion history. It's almost like a thread that runs through everything, sometimes more visible, sometimes less, but always there. Take heels, for instance, high heels. They're such a normal part of our visual landscape now that we don't always stop to think about how strange they really are. A high heel lifts the heel of your foot several inches off the ground and forces all of your weight forward onto the ball of your foot and your toes. It changes your posture entirely. It makes your legs look longer. Yes. It changes the line of your body. Yes. But it also makes walking slower, more deliberate, more precarious. You can't run in a very high heel, not really. You can't stand for hours without pain. Every step requires a kind of attention, a kind of balance. And again, this isn't an accident. Heels, when they first became popular among European aristocracy in the 16th and 17th centuries, were worn by men as much as by women, sometimes more so. They were associated with horseback riding initially, with the nobility who could afford horses and who didn't walk long distances. The heel helped keep the foot secure in a stirrup, but over time, heels evolved into something else, something more symbolic. They became a sign of wealth precisely because they made walking difficult. They announced that the wearer didn't need to walk far, didn't need to hurry, didn't need to be practical. The discomfort was the luxury. Think about powdered wigs, those enormous, elaborate constructions that were popular among European aristocracy in the 17th and 18th centuries. They were hot, unbearably hot, especially in summer. They were heavy, they were itchy, they required constant maintenance, constant powdering, constant styling. They attracted lice. They were, by any reasonable standard, deeply uncomfortable. But they were also extraordinarily expensive. They required the labor of skilled wig makers, they required expensive materials, and they required time, both to create and to maintain. And so they became a status symbol. The very impracticality of them was the point. You wore a powdered wig because you could afford to be impractical, because your life was not constrained by the same concerns as ordinary people. And this pattern continues. Think about the crinolines of the mid-19th century, those vast cage structures that made women's skirts balloon out to enormous widths. A woman in a crinoline took up space. She took up so much space that she had difficulty moving through doorways, sitting in chairs, riding in carriages. Her clothing announced her presence before she entered a room. And again, the impracticality was the point. A woman in a crinoline couldn't work. She couldn't do anything that required free movement or physical exertion. Her body was a spectacle, a display of wealth and leisure. Or think about the extremely stiff, high collars that men wore in the Victorian era and into the early 20th century. These collars were made of starched linen or celluloid, and they were so rigid that they restricted the movement of the head and neck. You couldn't look down comfortably. You couldn't turn your head quickly. There are accounts of men fainting from the restriction, particularly on hot days. But the collar was a mark of respectability, of professionalism, of membership in a certain class. The discomfort was something you endured because it signaled that you belonged. What all of these examples share is a kind of fundamental rejection of the body's natural desires. The body wants to be comfortable. It wants to move freely. It wants to breathe deeply. It wants to maintain its own temperature. But luxury fashion historically, has said no, no to all of that. Because luxury fashion was never really about the body's comfort. It was about the body's transformation into something else, into a sign, a symbol, a message that could be read by others. The body became a canvas for the display of wealth, and that display required discipline, required endurance, required the willingness to suffer in small, constant ways. And this idea of discipline is important, because luxury fashion has always had a relationship with self-control, with the mastery of the body's impulses. Think about the way that restrictive clothing enforces a certain kind of deportment, a certain way of moving and being in the world. When you're wearing a corset, you can't slouch. When you're wearing high heels, you can't run. When you're wearing a stiff collar, you can't crane your neck. The clothing literally shapes your behavior. It forces you into a kind of performance, a kind of constant awareness of how you're presenting yourself to the world. And in many ways, this was exactly what the upper classes wanted. They wanted their clothing to distinguish them, not just visually, but behaviorally. They wanted to move differently, to hold themselves differently, to exist in a different register than everyone else. There's a theory, and it's one that I find quite compelling, that clothing has always been about more than just protection or modesty or even decoration. Clothing is about the creation of social bodies, bodies that mean something beyond their mere physicality. When you put on certain garments, you're not just covering your body, you're transforming it into something that can be read, that can be interpreted, that carries information about who you are and where you belong in the social hierarchy. And luxury fashion, more than any other kind of clothing, is designed to make that transformation as complete and as legible as possible. The discomfort is part of the transformation. It's part of what makes the clothing work as a social signal. Let's think for a moment about fabrics, because even the materials themselves, the actual substances that luxury garments are made from, often prioritize beauty and status over comfort. Heavy brocades, for instance, woven with gold or silver thread, stiff silks that hold their shape regardless of the body beneath them, thick velvets that are magnificent to look at, but sweltering to wear, delicate tools and laces that scratch and snag, leather that needs to be broken in, that starts out rigid and unforgiving. These materials are chosen for their visual impact, for their rarity, for the skill required to work with them, for the way they catch light or create volume or signal expense. The fact that they might be uncomfortable to wear is secondary, or perhaps not even considered at all. And then there's the question of tailoring, of construction. True luxury garments, the kind that are made by hand in ateliers, the kind that take hundreds of hours to create, these pieces are often structured in ways that are fundamentally at odds with the body's natural lines. They create silhouettes that are architectural, that are sculptural, that impose a shape rather than following one. Think about a perfectly tailored men's suit, the kind that costs thousands upon thousands of dollars. It's beautiful. It's incredibly beautiful, but it's also quite stiff. The shoulders are padded and structured. The chest is canvas to hold a certain shape. The jacket is designed to be worn buttoned, which restricts your movement. You can't reach up easily. You can't twist comfortably. The suit imposes its will on your body rather than adapting to it. And that's precisely what makes it luxurious. It's not a garment that serves the body. It's a garment that the body serves. Women's haute couture is even more extreme in this regard. The clothes that come down the runways in Paris during Fashion Week, the pieces that are made to order for private clients, these garments often bear only a passing relationship to comfort. They're works of art, really. They're sculptures that happen to be worn on human bodies. But they're not designed for living in, not in any ordinary sense. They're designed for moments, for photographs, for entrances and exits, and the brief, brilliant interval of being seen. The rest of the time, one imagines, they're quite difficult to inhabit. I think about Alexander McQueen's work quite often in this context. McQueen, who died in 2010, was one of the most brilliant and uncompromising designers of the late 20th and early 21st centuries. And his work was often explicitly about discomfort, about the body in extremis, about fashion as a kind of beautiful violence. He created dresses with impossibly low-cut backs that required the wearer to stand perfectly upright or risk exposure. He made corsets that were works of exquisite craftsmanship, but that compressed the body to extraordinary degrees. He sent models down runways in shoes that were almost unwalkable, in garments that restricted movement, in pieces that seemed to be testing the limits of what a body could endure in the name of beauty. But McQueen understood something essential about luxury fashion. He understood that it was never really about making life easier or more comfortable. It was about transformation, about transcendence, about turning the body into something more than just a body. His clothes were uncomfortable, yes, but they were also undeniably powerful. They changed the way the wearer moved, the way they held themselves, the way they were perceived by others. They created a kind of aura, a sense that the person inside them was operating according to different rules, inhabiting a different reality. And this brings us to something interesting, something that maybe we don't talk about enough. The discomfort of luxury fashion isn't just a byproduct of its design. In many cases, it's part of the appeal. There's something about enduring discomfort for the sake of beauty, for the sake of status, that feels meaningful to people. It feels like a sacrifice, like you're giving something up in order to gain something else, something intangible but valuable. The pain of breaking in an expensive pair of shoes, the strain of holding your posture in a structured garment, the constant awareness of your body that comes from wearing something restrictive. All of this creates a kind of heightened experience. You're not just wearing clothes. You're performing a version of yourself that requires effort, that requires dedication. This is particularly true for women's fashion, historically and even today. Women's luxury fashion has almost always been more uncomfortable than men's, more restrictive, more demanding. High heels, tight dresses, undergarments that compress and reshape, garments that are difficult to put on and take off without assistance. There's a whole history here of women's bodies being treated as objects to be displayed, to be made beautiful at any cost. And the cost, very often, has been measured in discomfort, in pain, in the constant, low-level suffering that comes from wearing clothes that don't really accommodate the reality of having a body. But here's where it gets complicated. Because even though we can trace this history, even though we can point to the ways that fashion has disciplined and constrained women's bodies, We also have to acknowledge that many women have chosen these garments, have desired them, have felt powerful in them despite, or perhaps because, of their discomfort. There's something about the transformation that luxury fashion offers that feels worth the price. It's not just about pleasing others or conforming to standards imposed from outside. It's also about the pleasure of transformation itself, the pleasure of becoming something other than your everyday self. Think about the psychological aspect of this. When you put on an uncomfortable but beautiful garment, you're immediately more conscious of your body. You're aware of your posture, your movements, the space you're taking up. This heightened awareness can feel like a kind of power. You're not just moving through the world in the usual, unconscious way. You're performing. You're deliberate. Every gesture has weight. And there's something intoxicating about that. Something that makes the discomfort feel almost worthwhile. Let's talk Rei Kawakubo for a moment. Kawakubo, the founder of Comme des Garçons, has spent decades creating clothing that challenges every conventional notion of beauty and comfort. Her collections have featured garments with enormous, asymmetrical padded protrusions that completely distort the body's silhouette. She's made dresses that are flat in the front and bulbous in the back, or that have strange lumps at the shoulders or hips. She's created pieces that are deliberately difficult to wear, that make the body into something alien, something unfamiliar. And critics have called her work unwearable, uncomfortable, even ugly. But Kawakubo has never been interested in making clothes that flatter or comfort. She's interested in making clothes that provoke, that challenge, that make you reconsider what a body can be and what clothing can do. And her work raises an interesting question. What is clothing for? If we strip away all the assumptions we usually make, all the ideas about function and comfort, and making the body look attractive by conventional standards, what's left? For Kawakubo, clothing is a way of creating new shapes, new ideas about the body and its possibilities. The fact that her garments are uncomfortable, that they're difficult to wear, that's not a failure. That's part of the point. She's asking you to work for it, to think about it, to engage with clothing as something other than a passive backdrop to your life. Yohji Yamamoto is another designer whose work exists in this space between beauty and difficulty. Yamamoto's garments are often loose and flowing, which might seem comfortable, but they're also made from heavy, substantial fabrics that have weight and presence. They don't disappear on the body. They make themselves felt. And they require a certain kind of confidence to wear, a willingness to be enveloped, to be draped, to let the fabric take up space around you. His clothes are not about revealing the body or emphasizing its conventional attractive features. They're about creating a kind of mystery, a sense that there's something more to the person beneath the fabric than you're being allowed to see. Martin Margiela, too, created work that was often quite uncomfortable. Margiela was fascinated by deconstruction, by taking garments apart and revealing their inner workings, their seams and linings, and the usually hidden infrastructure that makes clothing work. He made jackets that were flat and two-dimensional, like paper dolls come to life. He created garments from recycled materials, from things that were never meant to be clothing at all. And while his work was conceptually brilliant, it wasn't always easy to wear. seams were left raw, edges were left unfinished, structures were exposed and sometimes scratchy or awkward. But this was part of the honesty of his work, part of what made it so compelling. He wasn't trying to create a perfect illusion of effortless beauty. He was showing you the work, the construction, the reality of what clothing is and how it's made. All of these designers share a kind of radical honesty about fashion. They're not pretending that their garments are comfortable. They're not trying to make clothing that serves the body in any conventional sense. They're interested in clothing as a form of expression, as a way of exploring ideas about beauty and identity, and the relationship between the body and the social world. And their work is uncomfortable, often deliberately so, because comfort would get in the way of the ideas they're trying to explore. But let's come back to more traditional luxury for a moment, because it's not just avant-garde designers who create uncomfortable clothing. The whole industry, at its highest levels, is built on a foundation of discomfort. Think about red carpet events, about the gowns that actresses and models wear to premieres and award shows. These dresses are often incredibly beautiful, breathtakingly so. But they're also notoriously difficult to wear. They're heavy, with layers and layers of fabric, and sometimes elaborate beading or embroidery that adds significant weight. They're tight in some places and voluminous in others. They require assistance to put on and take off. They're not designed for sitting, so women often stand for hours or perch on the edges of chairs. They're not designed for eating, so dinner at these events becomes a challenge. The whole experience is an exercise in endurance. And yet, these gowns are coveted. Designers lend them to celebrities, knowing that the photographs will appear in magazines and online, that they'll be analyzed and admired. The women who wear them are praised for their beauty, their elegance, their style. The discomfort is never mentioned, or if it is, it's mentioned in a light, joking way that doesn't really capture the reality of spending hours in a garment that was never designed for human comfort. The discomfort is the price of admission to this world, the thing you endure in order to participate in the spectacle. There's a particular kind of shoe that comes to mind when I think about this. The very high, very thin stiletto heel. The kind that fashion people call a pump, but that most of us just call torture devices. These shoes are beautiful, undeniably so. They elongate the leg, they add height, they make a particular kind of clicking sound on hard floors that announces your presence. But they're also incredibly painful. The higher the heel, the more weight is concentrated on the ball of your foot and your toes. Your foot is forced into an unnatural position. Your toes are compressed into a narrow toe box. The thin heel makes balance precarious. And if you wear these shoes for any length of time, the pain can be extraordinary. Your feet ache, your calves cramp, your back strains from the altered posture. And yet, these shoes remain a staple of luxury fashion. They're what you wear when you want to look expensive, sophisticated, powerful. And here's something interesting. The pain of wearing these shoes has become so normalized that we barely even talk about it anymore. Women carry emergency flats in their bags. They talk about breaking in new shoes, about building up tolerance, about the inevitable blisters and bruises that come with any new pair. There's almost a kind of pride in it, a sense that you're tough enough to handle the pain, that you're willing to make the sacrifice for beauty. The discomfort becomes a kind of badge of honor, proof that you're serious about fashion, that you understand what's required. But why? Why is any of this necessary? Why has luxury fashion evolved in this direction, toward discomfort, toward garments that constrain and restrict and demand rather than accommodate? The answer, I think, has to do with the fundamental purpose of luxury, which has never really been about personal comfort or convenience. Luxury is about distinction. It's about creating and maintaining boundaries between those who have access to certain things and those who don't. And in the case of clothing, one of the most effective ways to create that distinction is through the very impracticality of the garments themselves. When you wear something uncomfortable, something that requires effort and endurance, you're signaling that your life is not governed by the same necessities as most people's lives. You can afford to be impractical. You can afford to prioritize appearance over function. You have the resources, both financial and social, to insulate yourself from the consequences of wearing clothing that doesn't actually work very well for doing things in. This is why historically, the most elaborate, most uncomfortable fashions were worn by aristocrats and the very wealthy. Their clothing was a constant, visible reminder that they didn't work, that they didn't need to move efficiently or comfortably, that their primary occupation was simply being seen and admired. And this logic persists today, even in a world where most people, even wealthy people, do have to work, do have to move through space, do have to accomplish practical tasks. Luxury fashion still operates according to this older model, where clothing is primarily about display rather than utility. The discomfort is part of the luxury because it proves that you have the resources and the willpower to endure it, that you value beauty and status highly enough to sacrifice comfort for them. There's also something about the relationship between pain and discipline that's worth exploring. In many cultures and throughout much of history, the ability to endure physical discomfort has been associated with virtue, with strength of character, with self-control. Think about religious asceticism, about monks who wear rough cloth and sleep on hard beds, about the idea that suffering brings you closer to something pure or meaningful. Fashion taps into this same impulse. When you wear uncomfortable clothing, you're demonstrating a kind of discipline, a willingness to subordinate your body's immediate desires to some larger goal. And in the context of luxury fashion, that goal is the creation of a self that is beautiful, polished, perfect, worthy of admiration. This is especially true in contexts where appearance is scrutinized, where you're being judged, where there's something at stake. Job interviews, first dates, important social events. These are all occasions where people tend to wear their most uncomfortable clothes because they want to present the best possible version of themselves. And they've learned that the best version is often the one that requires the most effort, the most sacrifice. There's an unspoken understanding that comfort is casual, is everyday, is not serious. If you want to be taken seriously, if you want to command respect, you wear the clothing that shows you're willing to work for it. Even if that work takes the form of enduring hours in shoes that hurt, or a jacket that restricts your breathing. Let's think about the fashion show itself for a moment, because fashion shows are really the ultimate expression of this philosophy. Models on runways are not comfortable. They're wearing sample sizes, which are usually quite small, and garments that are often pinned or taped to fit them. They're wearing shoes that may not be their size. They're walking on hard surfaces in extremely high heels, often with platforms or unusual constructions that make balance difficult. The lighting is hot. The music is loud. They're expected to move in a very specific way, with a particular kind of stride and attitude, and this movement is dictated by the clothes rather than by what feels natural or comfortable to them. And they do all of this while being watched by hundreds or thousands of people, while being photographed and filmed, while knowing that any misstep will be captured and potentially circulated widely. The whole apparatus of the fashion show is designed to display clothing in the most visually striking way possible, and human comfort is simply not a consideration. The models are, in a sense, living mannequins, bodies that exist to show off the designer's vision. And the clothes themselves are created with this context in mind. They're designed to look incredible when someone is walking in a straight line down a runway, not when someone is sitting at a desk or riding a subway or cooking dinner. The movement is stylized, theatrical. Real life, with its messy, complicated physicality, is not part of the equation. And yet, this is what influences the rest of fashion, what sets the trends, what determines what will be considered beautiful and desirable in the coming season. Clothing that was designed for a very specific, very artificial context gets translated into ready-to-wear collections, gets copied and reinterpreted by mass-market brands, filters down through the entire fashion ecosystem. And along the way, the discomfort often comes with it, because the discomfort is part of the aesthetic, part of what makes the clothing feel luxurious and special and worth aspiring to. There's a paradox here, though, and it's one that the fashion industry has been grappling with more and more in recent years. On one hand, there's this long tradition of luxury fashion being uncomfortable, impractical, demanding. On the other hand, we live in a moment where comfort has become increasingly valued, where athleisure and sneakers and soft, stretchy fabrics have moved from being weekend wear to being acceptable in almost any context. The rise of remote work has accelerated this even more. When people are at home, they wear comfortable clothing. And once you've experienced that comfort, it's hard to go back to the old way of dressing, where you squeeze into stiff, restrictive garments every day. So luxury fashion has had to adapt, at least to some degree. We've seen the emergence of what you might call luxurious comfort, garments that are made from expensive materials and beautifully constructed, but that also accommodate the body's desire for ease. Cashmere track pants that cost hundreds of dollars, silk t-shirts, sneakers made from the finest leather and priced accordingly. This is luxury fashion, trying to have it both ways, trying to maintain its status and exclusivity while also acknowledging that people don't want to be uncomfortable all the time. But here's the thing. Even within this newer paradigm, discomfort hasn't disappeared. It's just shifted. Those luxury sneakers might be more comfortable than stilettos, but they're still not as comfortable as a regular pair of running shoes. They're often made with stiffer leather. They often have less cushioning. They often prioritize aesthetics over support. That cashmere tracksuit is lovely, but it also requires careful washing. it can't just be thrown in the dryer. It needs to be treated delicately. The luxury is still somewhat at odds with true comfort, with the kind of ease that comes from clothing that doesn't require any thought or maintenance or special treatment. And in the realm of true high fashion, of haute couture and runway collections, discomfort remains central. If anything, it's become even more extreme in some ways. Designers continue to push boundaries, to create garments that are more sculptural, more architectural, more challenging to wear. Because at that level, fashion isn't really about clothing anymore. It's about ideas, about art, about making statements. The fact that the garments are uncomfortable, that they're difficult to wear, that they're not practical for everyday life, that's not a bug. That's a feature. It's what separates high fashion from ordinary clothing, what makes it special, what justifies its extraordinary cost and prestige. Think about the way that luxury fashion photographs. In editorial shoots for magazines like Vogue or Harper's Bazaar, the models are often posed in ways that are clearly uncomfortable. They're bent at awkward angles, they're standing on one leg, they're arching their backs in ways that can't possibly be sustainable. But the photographs are beautiful. The discomfort creates interesting shapes, dynamic lines, a sense of tension and drama that makes the images compelling. And this is what luxury fashion is selling. Not comfort, not ease, but this kind of heightened, dramatic beauty. The sense that the person wearing these clothes is living in a different register than ordinary life. There's also something to be said about the relationship between luxury fashion and time. Comfortable clothing is efficient. You can throw it on without thinking about it. It doesn't require special undergarments or careful arrangement. It doesn't need to be adjusted throughout the day. But luxury fashion demands time. Time to put it on properly. Time to ensure everything is sitting correctly. Time to move carefully so nothing shifts or wrinkles. Time to take it off and store it properly. This demand on your time is, in itself, a luxury. It says that your time is not governed by practical concerns, that you can afford to spend 20 minutes getting dressed, that you have the leisure to attend to these details. And this brings us to something that's perhaps a bit uncomfortable to acknowledge. Luxury fashion has always been, at least in part, about class distinction, about making visible the differences between those who have and those who don't. And discomfort has been one of the tools used to create and maintain that distinction. The people who can afford to wear uncomfortable clothing, who have the social and economic resources to structure their lives around these impractical garments, are announcing their membership in a particular class. They're saying, through their clothing, that they don't live the way you live, that their concerns and priorities are different from yours. This is why, historically, sumptuary laws existed in many societies. These were laws that restricted who could wear certain types of clothing, certain colors, certain fabrics. The laws were designed to maintain social hierarchies, to prevent people from lower classes from dressing above their station. And while we don't have formal sumptuary laws anymore, the price of luxury fashion serves a similar function. The discomfort is part of what makes the clothing exclusive, what ensures that it remains the province of a select few. But there's another layer to this that we should consider. Beyond the social and economic functions of uncomfortable luxury fashion, there's also a psychological dimension. There's something about the experience of wearing beautiful but uncomfortable clothing that can feel almost transcendent. You're aware of your body in a different way. You're moving through the world with a heightened sense of presence. Every step, every gesture feels deliberate, meaningful. It's almost meditative in a way, this constant awareness of the physical form you're presenting to the world. Some people find this experience genuinely pleasurable, even when it's painful. There's a certain satisfaction in enduring something difficult for the sake of beauty, a sense of accomplishment in making it, through an event in shoes that hurt or a dress that's too tight. It's not dissimilar from the satisfaction that comes from completing a difficult workout or fasting or any other form of voluntary physical challenge. You're proving something to yourself, demonstrating that you have control over your body, that you can make it do things that are difficult or uncomfortable because you've decided that the end result is worth it. And fashion, at its highest levels, understands this psychology. It understands that people are willing to suffer for beauty, that there's something compelling about the transformation that fashion can offer, even when that transformation comes at a physical cost. The discomfort becomes part of the ritual, part of the experience of participating in fashion. It's what separates getting dressed from really dressing, from making an event out of your appearance, from turning your body into a work of art. Let's think about wedding dresses for a moment, because wedding dresses are a perfect example of this dynamic. A wedding dress is often the most expensive, most elaborate garment that a woman will ever wear. And wedding dresses are frequently quite uncomfortable. They're heavy, with layers of fabric and sometimes corsetry built into the bodice. They're restrictive, often with tight bodices and full skirts that make sitting difficult. They're delicate, requiring careful handling and movement. The bride can't eat normally, can't move normally, often can't even use the bathroom without assistance. She spends hours in this dress, through the ceremony and the reception, photographs and dancing, and by the end of the day, she's usually exhausted and sore and ready to change into something more comfortable. But the discomfort is accepted, expected even, because the wedding dress is not ordinary clothing. It's a costume for a performance, a symbol of a significant transition, a garment that exists outside of everyday concerns. The bride is willing to be uncomfortable because the dress transforms her into something special, something worthy of the occasion. And everyone understands this. No one expects the wedding dress to be practical or comfortable. Those aren't the standards by which it's judged. It's judged by how beautiful it is, how well it photographs, how perfectly it captures a particular fantasy of bridal beauty. And this is true of many forms of formal wear, of evening gowns and tuxedos and all the elaborate clothing that people wear for special occasions. These garments exist in a different category than everyday clothing. They're not judged by the same criteria. Comfort is irrelevant, or at least secondary, to other considerations. What matters is the effect, the transformation, the creation of a version of yourself that is elevated, special, worthy of being remembered. There's something almost ritualistic about this, about the way that uncomfortable clothing, marks certain moments as important, as set apart from ordinary time. When you put on formal wear, when you endure the discomfort of a tight collar or high heels or a restrictive dress, you're signaling that this moment matters, that you're willing to make a sacrifice, to endure something difficult in order to mark its significance. The clothing becomes a kind of offering, a demonstration of respect for the occasion and for the people you're with. And luxury fashion has always understood this ritualistic dimension of clothing. It's not just about covering the body, or even about making the body look attractive. It's about transformation, about turning the act of getting dressed into something meaningful, something that connects you to traditions and histories and communities. When you wear clothing that is uncomfortable, that requires effort and discipline, you're participating in a kind of shared understanding about what matters, about what's worth sacrificing for. But we should also acknowledge that this system has its costs, and not just physical costs, though those are real. There are also psychological costs to living in a world where your appearance is constantly being judged, where the standards of beauty require discomfort and sacrifice, where you feel pressure to endure pain in order to be seen as attractive or successful or worthy of respect. This pressure falls particularly heavily on women who have historically been held to much stricter standards of appearance than men, and for whom the connection between beauty and social value has always been more explicit, more inescapable. Think about what it means to grow up in a culture that tells you, in 1,000 subtle and not so subtle ways, that your value is tied to your appearance, and that achieving the right kind of appearance requires suffering. You learn very early that beauty is something you have to work for, something that doesn't come naturally, something that requires tools and techniques and the willingness to be uncomfortable. You learn to wear shoes that hurt because that's what grown women do. You learn to squeeze into shapewear because that's what makes your clothes look right. You learn to endure the pain of waxing or threading or any number of beauty treatments because smooth skin, hairless skin, is what's expected. And all of this discomfort becomes so normalized that you stop even questioning it. It's just what you do. It's the price of being a woman in a world that scrutinizes women's bodies. And luxury fashion amplifies all of this. It takes these existing expectations and raises the stakes even higher. It says that if regular beauty requires some discomfort, then extraordinary beauty, the kind of beauty that signals wealth and status and taste, requires even more. The heels get higher, the waists get tighter, the garments get more restrictive, and the women who can endure all of this, who can move through the world in these elaborate, uncomfortable constructions with apparent grace and ease, are held up as ideals, as examples of what true femininity looks like. But here's what we don't always acknowledge. The apparent ease is a performance. The women who look effortless in their uncomfortable clothing have worked very hard to make it look effortless. They've practiced walking in those shoes. They've learned how to sit and stand and move in those dresses. They've mastered the art of appearing comfortable when they're actually in pain. And this, too, is part of what luxury fashion demands. Not just that you wear the uncomfortable clothing, but that you wear it well, that you make it look natural, that you never let anyone see how much effort it's actually taking. This expectation of effortlessness, of making difficulty look easy, is deeply gendered. Men's formal wear can be uncomfortable, certainly. A tuxedo with its stiff collar and bow tie is not the most relaxing thing to wear, but it doesn't compare to what women are expected to endure. And more importantly, men are allowed to acknowledge discomfort. A man can loosen his tie, can complain about his shoes, can sit down and relax without being judged for it. But a woman in formal wear is expected to maintain the illusion, to stay poised and graceful no matter what. Any sign of discomfort, any adjustment or complaint breaks the spell, reveals the work that's going into the performance. And this gets at something fundamental about the way that luxury fashion operates differently for men and women. Men's luxury fashion, historically and even today, has been more about subtle signals, about the quality of materials and the precision of tailoring, about things that people who know what to look for can recognize, but that don't necessarily announce themselves. A well-made men's suit is beautiful, but its beauty is quiet, understated. It doesn't demand attention in the same way that a woman's gown demands attention. And while it may be somewhat uncomfortable, it's not theatrical in its discomfort. It's not asking the wearer to transform themselves into a spectacle. Women's luxury fashion, on the other hand, has always been more about spectacle, about visibility, about creating a presence that cannot be ignored. And this requires more extreme measures, more dramatic silhouettes, more elaborate constructions. The discomfort scales up accordingly, because the goal is not just to look wealthy or tasteful, though those things matter, but to be looked at, to command attention, to create a visual impact that stops people in their tracks. And there's something deeply complicated about this, something that feminism has been wrestling with for decades. On one hand, there's pleasure in being beautiful, in creating yourself as a work of art, in wielding the power that comes from being visually striking. Many women genuinely enjoy fashion, enjoy the creativity and self-expression that it offers, enjoy the transformation that beautiful clothing can provide. On the other hand, there's the reality that women's bodies are scrutinized in ways that men's bodies aren't, that women face much more pressure to meet certain appearance standards, that the work and discomfort required to achieve those standards is far greater for women than for men. So, where does choice end and coercion begin? Where does self-expression become self-discipline imposed from outside? I don't think there are easy answers to these questions. Fashion, and particularly luxury fashion, exists in this complicated space where pleasure and pain, choice and obligation, self-expression and social pressure all coexist and overlap. You can enjoy wearing beautiful clothes and still resent the expectation that you should wear them. You can find empowerment in your appearance and still be angry about the double standards that govern how men and women are supposed to look. These things aren't contradictory. They're just the messy reality of living in a body in a world that has very strong opinions about what bodies should look like and how they should be presented. Let's think about the language we use around fashion for a moment. We talk about fashion victims, about slaves to fashion, about suffering for beauty. The language is revealing. It acknowledges implicitly, that there's something punishing about the pursuit of fashion, something that can feel like a loss of autonomy, like you're serving the clothes rather than the clothes serving you. And yet, we keep using this language in a kind of joking, affectionate way, as if the suffering is charming, as if it's something to be admired rather than questioned. There's a famous quote, often attributed to various fashion designers and editors, that says something like, "I don't understand how a woman can leave the house without fixing herself up and looking her best, even if it takes an hour or more. I think it's respect for herself and for others." And this sentiment, this idea that you owe it to yourself and to the world to always look perfect, no matter how much time and effort and discomfort it requires. This is one of the foundational beliefs of luxury fashion culture. Your appearance is a moral obligation. Discomfort is a small price to pay for meeting that obligation. But imagine if we applied this logic to men in the same way. Imagine if men were expected to spend an hour getting dressed every morning, to wear clothing that was restrictive and uncomfortable, to endure physical pain as a matter of course in order to be considered presentable. The absurdity would be immediately apparent. And yet, for women, this has been the norm for centuries. It's only in recent decades that we've even begun to question whether it has to be this way, whether comfort and beauty are really mutually exclusive, whether there might be other ways to think about fashion and self-presentation. And the fashion industry has responded to these questions in interesting ways. On one hand, there has been a genuine shift toward more comfortable clothing, more practical designs, more acknowledgement that people have lives to live and bodies that need to move. Athleisure, as I mentioned earlier, has become not just acceptable, but fashionable. Flat shoes are having a moment. Brands are marketing comfort as a feature rather than something to be ashamed of. But, on the other hand, high fashion, luxury fashion, at the level of couture and runway collections, remains as uncompromising as ever. If anything, there's been a kind of doubling down, a reassertion that real fashion, fashion as art, fashion as statement, requires sacrifice. The discomfort is what makes it matter, what makes it different from ordinary clothing. If you want comfort, the logic goes, you can buy that anywhere. But if you want fashion, real fashion, you have to be willing to suffer for it. And there's a way in which this makes sense from the industry's perspective. Luxury fashion needs to maintain its distinction, needs to preserve the sense that what it's offering is rare and special and not accessible to everyone. And if fashion becomes too comfortable, too practical, too accommodating of the body's needs, then what separates it from regular clothing? The discomfort becomes a feature that can't be easily replicated, can't be knocked off by fast fashion brands, can't be democratized. It remains the province of those who have the resources and the commitment to endure it. But I keep coming back to this question of why people desire this. Why do people want clothing that makes them uncomfortable? What is it about the experience of wearing beautiful but painful garments that continues to hold such appeal? And I think the answer has to do with transformation, with the sense that fashion allows you to become someone other than your everyday self. When you put on an extraordinary garment, something that changes your silhouette, that makes you move differently, that makes other people look at you differently, You're not just changing your clothes. You're changing who you are, at least temporarily. At least in the context of whatever event or occasion you're dressing for. And there's something powerful about that. Something that feels worth the discomfort. In our ordinary lives, we're constrained by all sorts of things. By our jobs and responsibilities. By other people's expectations. By the mundane necessities of getting through the day. But when you dress up, when you put on something extraordinary, you're stepping outside of all that, at least for a moment. You're creating a version of yourself that exists in a different register, that operates according to different rules. The discomfort is part of what makes that transformation feel real, feel significant. It's a reminder that you're not in your everyday life anymore, that you've crossed over into something else, something more heightened and intense and memorable. This is particularly true for clothing that's associated with significant life events. Wedding dresses, as I mentioned earlier, but also prom dresses, graduation robes, any kind of ceremonial or ritual clothing. These garments mark transitions, moments when you're moving from one phase of life to another. And the formality of them, the discomfort of them, helps to create a sense of gravity, of importance. You remember how you felt in those clothes, precisely because they made you so aware of your body, so conscious of every movement and gesture. There's also something about the relationship between luxury fashion and memory that's worth exploring. Comfortable clothing tends to fade into the background. You don't remember what you were wearing on an ordinary day because the clothes weren't demanding your attention. But uncomfortable clothing makes itself unforgettable. You remember the shoes that gave you blisters, the dress that was too tight, the jacket that made your shoulders ache. The discomfort creates a kind of sensory memory that stays with you. And in a strange way, this makes the clothing more valuable, more meaningful. It becomes part of the story of that day, that event, that moment in your life. Fashion photographers understand this intuitively. When you look at fashion editorials, you're not seeing comfortable people. You're seeing people in states of physical extremity, bent and twisted into shapes that highlight the clothing. The discomfort is visible, palpable, and yet it's presented as beautiful, as aspirational. The model suffering in impossible heels, balancing on one leg, arching her back at an improbable angle. She becomes a kind of martyr to beauty, someone who's willing to endure anything for the sake of the image. And we admire this. We find it compelling. There's something about that willingness to suffer that reads as commitment, as seriousness, as proof that fashion matters. And maybe that's what it comes down to, in the end. The discomfort of luxury fashion is a way of demonstrating that fashion matters to you, that you take it seriously, that you're willing to make sacrifices for it. In a world where so many things are easy and comfortable and convenient, where you can order anything you want with a few clicks and have it delivered to your door, there's something almost defiant about choosing difficulty, about choosing clothing that demands something from you. This connects to a broader cultural anxiety about ease, about the sense that things that come too easily aren't valuable, aren't meaningful. We distrust comfort in some fundamental way. We associate it with laziness, with complacency, with a kind of moral softness, whereas discomfort, struggle, difficulty, these things feel virtuous. They feel like proof that you're working, that you're striving, that you're not just passively consuming, but actively creating something, even if what you're creating is just an appearance, just a version of yourself to present to the world. Luxury fashion taps into this anxiety. It offers you the opportunity to prove your commitment, your discipline, your willingness to work for beauty. And in exchange, it gives you access to a certain kind of social and cultural capital, to the recognition that comes from being well-dressed, from demonstrating that you understand the codes and conventions of high fashion, from showing that you belong to a particular world. But there's something melancholy about all of this, isn't there? Something sad about the idea that we need to suffer in order to be beautiful, that our bodies need to be disciplined and constrained and reshaped in order to be acceptable. There's a violence to it, even when the violence is subtle, even when it's presented as choice and self-expression. Because the underlying message is always the same. Your body, as it naturally exists, is not enough. It needs to be improved, corrected, transformed. And that transformation requires pain. And yet, I don't think the answer is to simply reject fashion, to dismiss it as superficial or oppressive, and withdraw from it entirely. Because fashion is also a form of creativity, a form of play, a way of exploring identity and presenting yourself to the world. It can be joyful and expressive and empowering. The problem isn't fashion itself, but rather the narrowness of what's considered fashionable, the rigidity of the standards, the way that certain bodies and certain presentations are valued, while others are dismissed or ignored. What if luxury fashion could expand its definition of beauty to include comfort, not as a concession or compromise, but as a genuine value, something that's considered as important as silhouette, or craftsmanship, or innovation? What if the most coveted, most expensive, most prestigious garments were also the ones that felt best to wear, that moved with your body rather than against it, that enhanced your comfort rather than demanding that you sacrifice it? Some designers are already exploring this territory. There's a growing movement toward clothing that is both beautiful and functional, that respects the body's needs while still offering the creativity and craft that define luxury. Eileen Fisher has been doing this for years, creating elegant, well-made clothing from natural fibers that drapes rather than constrains. The Row, founded by Mary Kate and Ashley Olsen, makes luxurious, minimalist pieces that prioritize quality and comfort. Even some more avant-garde designers, like Lemaire and Jill Sander in her various incarnations, have found ways to create fashion that is intellectually interesting and visually striking without being punishingly uncomfortable. But these examples are still somewhat marginal, still seen as alternatives to real fashion, rather than as fashion in themselves. The mainstream of luxury fashion, the brands that dominate fashion weeks and magazine covers and red carpets, still largely operate according to the old logic, where discomfort is a feature rather than a bug, where the body must adapt to the clothing, rather than the clothing adapting to the body. And as long as that remains true, as long as discomfort is built into the very definition of what luxury fashion is, people will continue to desire it. Because we don't just want the clothing, we want what the clothing represents. We want the transformation, the elevation, the sense of participating in something rare and special and exclusive. We want to feel like we've achieved something, like we've proven ourselves worthy. And if the price of admission is physical discomfort, well, that's a price that many people are willing to pay. There's also something about the relationship between fashion and the gaze of others that's important here. Fashion, perhaps more than any other art form, is fundamentally social. You don't dress for yourself alone, or at least not entirely. You dress to be seen, to be looked at, to create an impression on others. And the gaze of others can be both validating and constraining. It validates your effort, your taste, your commitment to presenting yourself in a certain way. But it also constrains you, holds you accountable to standards that you didn't necessarily choose, judges you according to criteria that may feel arbitrary or unfair. Uncomfortable fashion makes sense in this context because it's fashion that's optimized for being looked at rather than for being lived in. It creates striking visuals, interesting silhouettes, memorable images. The person wearing it may be suffering, but the people looking at them see only the beauty, the elegance, the perfect surface. The discomfort is hidden, private, something the wearer endures alone, while presenting a flawless exterior to the world. And there's something deeply isolating about this, about the gap between how you look and how you feel, between the image you're projecting and the physical reality you're experiencing. You're surrounded by people, being looked at by people, but in a fundamental way, you're alone with your discomfort. No one else can feel your feet aching in those shoes, your ribs compressed by that corset, your shoulders straining under the weight of that dress. The suffering is yours alone, even as the beauty is shared, is public, is offered up for everyone's appreciation. This is part of why fashion can feel so alienating sometimes, why it can create this sense of disconnection from your own body. You're aware of your body, intensely aware, because it's sending you constant signals of discomfort. But at the same time, you're disconnected from it, treating it as an object to be displayed, rather than as the site of your own experience, your own sensation, your own being in the world. You become split, divided between the body that feels and the body that's seen. And fashion operates in that split, in that gap between inner experience and outer appearance. I think about fashion models quite often in this context, because models are professionals at managing this split. They're trained to move through the world in uncomfortable clothing, with apparent ease, to make the difficulty look effortless, to present a perfect surface regardless of what they're actually feeling. And we admire them for this ability. We see it as a skill, a form of expertise, but it's also quite sad in a way. This professionalization of dissociation, this training in how to ignore your body's signals, how to override your own discomfort in service of an image. And yet, this is what all of us are doing, to some degree, when we wear uncomfortable luxury fashion. We're learning to manage the split, to maintain the performance, to keep the surface perfect, even as the interior experience is one of endurance and strain. We're learning to be our own models, our own walking advertisements for a version of ourselves that looks better than it feels. But perhaps I'm being too bleak about all of this, because there's also genuine pleasure in fashion, genuine creativity, and self-expression and joy. Not every uncomfortable garment is a burden. Sometimes the discomfort is part of the excitement, part of the thrill of transformation. Sometimes you put on something restrictive and uncomfortable, and you feel powerful in it. You feel like you've become someone more interesting, more complex, more worthy of attention. The discomfort doesn't diminish the experience, it intensifies it. And maybe that's okay. Maybe it's okay to sometimes choose discomfort, to consciously decide that the transformation is worth the cost, that you want the experience of wearing something extraordinary, even if it means being uncomfortable for a while. The problem isn't discomfort itself, but rather when discomfort becomes mandatory, when it's the only option available, when comfortable fashion is seen as somehow less valuable or less serious or less worth aspiring to. What we need, perhaps, is a broader range of choices. A fashion landscape where both comfort and discomfort are available, where both are valued, where you can choose between them based on the context and your mood and what you're trying to achieve, rather than having one option implicitly or explicitly required by social pressure and cultural expectations. The future of luxury fashion, if it's going to be genuinely inclusive and humane, needs to make space for multiple ways of relating to the body, multiple definitions of what beauty looks like, multiple standards for what makes clothing valuable and desirable. It needs to acknowledge that some people genuinely enjoy restrictive, challenging garments and want to wear them, while others find them oppressive and would prefer alternatives. Both of these preferences are valid. Both deserve to be accommodated. And we're starting to see hints of this more expansive approach, particularly from younger designers who are less invested in maintaining traditional hierarchies and more interested in exploring new possibilities. Designers who are working with adaptive fashion, with clothing designed for people with disabilities, that is also beautiful and thoughtfully made. Designers who are creating size-inclusive collections that don't treat larger bodies as an afterthought, but as equally worthy of beautiful, well-constructed clothing. Designers who are thinking about sustainability and longevity, creating pieces that are meant to be worn and lived in, rather than just displayed. These movements are still relatively small, still somewhat marginal within the broader fashion industry, but they represent a different vision of what luxury could be, a vision where quality and craftsmanship and beauty are not incompatible with comfort and practicality and respect for the diversity of human bodies and experiences. And perhaps that's where we're headed, slowly, unevenly, with plenty of resistance from those invested in the old ways of doing things. Perhaps the next generation of luxury fashion will be one where discomfort is an option rather than a requirement, where you can choose to wear restrictive, challenging garments when you want that experience, but where comfortable, wearable luxury is equally valued and equally available. Or perhaps not. Perhaps the connection between luxury and discomfort is too deep, too fundamental to the way that fashion operates as a system of distinction and exclusion. Perhaps luxury will always require some form of sacrifice, some demonstration that you're willing to endure difficulty for the sake of beauty and status. Perhaps the discomfort is not a bug that can be fixed, but an essential feature of what makes luxury luxury. I don't know the answer. I don't think anyone does. Fashion is constantly evolving, constantly responding to cultural shifts and economic pressures and changing values. What seems inevitable in one moment can become obsolete in the next. The corset, which once seemed like an essential component of women's fashion, is now largely a historical curiosity or a niche fetish item. High heels, which have been a staple of women's formal wear for decades, are starting to seem less mandatory, less required. Maybe in another generation, the whole edifice of uncomfortable luxury fashion will seem as strange and antiquated as powdered wigs seem to us now. Or maybe not. Maybe there's something about the human relationship to beauty and suffering that transcends cultural moment, that persists across time and place. Maybe we'll always be drawn to things that demand something from us, that require sacrifice and discipline and endurance. Maybe the discomfort is part of what makes the beauty meaningful, what makes it feel earned rather than given. What I do know is that the conversation is changing. People are asking more questions, demanding more from fashion, refusing to accept discomfort as an inevitable price of beauty. And the fashion industry is listening, at least to some degree, at least in some corners. Change is happening slowly, incrementally, but it's happening. And in the meantime, we exist in this complicated space where luxury fashion remains largely uncomfortable, where the most coveted garments are still the ones that demand the most from your body, where the performance of effortless perfection still requires considerable hidden effort. We navigate this space as best we can, making our own choices about when and how and whether to participate in fashion's demands, trying to find a balance between the pleasure of transformation and the cost of discomfort. Think about the last time you wore something really uncomfortable, something that made you very aware of your body, not in a pleasant way, but in a way that was slightly painful, slightly constraining. Maybe it was for a wedding or a job interview or a first date, some occasion that felt important enough to warrant the sacrifice. Do you remember how you felt? Not just physically, but emotionally, psychologically? Did the discomfort make you feel more present, more aware, more focused on the moment? Or did it just make you wish you could go home and change into something more comfortable? There's no right answer to these questions. Different people have different relationships to discomfort, different thresholds for pain, different feelings about the trade-offs involved in wearing beautiful but uncomfortable clothing. What feels empowering to one person might feel oppressive to another. What seems worth it in one context might seem absurd in another. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about luxury fashion and its relationship to discomfort. It's not a simple story with a clear moral. It's a complicated, ambiguous, deeply personal thing that means different things to different people in different moments. Fashion is never just about the clothes. It's about identity and desire and aspiration and belonging. It's about who we want to be and how we want to be seen. And sometimes achieving that requires discomfort. Sometimes it requires sacrifice. Sometimes it requires us to override our body's immediate desires in favor of some larger goal, some vision of ourselves that we're trying to bring into being. Whether that's good or bad, whether it's empowering or oppressive, whether it's worth it or not, These are questions that each of us has to answer for ourselves. There's no universal truth here, no objective standard we can apply. There's only the lived experience of being in a body in the world, trying to navigate the constant demands and expectations around how that body should look and be presented. What luxury fashion offers, at its best, is a kind of heightened experience of this navigation, a way of turning the everyday act of getting dressed into something more significant, more meaningful, more consciously chosen. The discomfort is part of what makes it significant. It's what separates luxury fashion from ordinary clothing, what makes it feel special, what makes it worth thinking about and talking about and writing long scripts about at 2 a.m. Because ultimately, fashion is about more than just fabric and construction and silhouette. It's about the stories we tell about ourselves and each other, about the values we hold, about what we think is important and beautiful and worth striving for. And the fact that luxury fashion has historically prioritized certain kinds of beauty over comfort, has valued discipline and endurance over ease, tells us something about the values that have shaped our culture, about what we've been taught to admire and aspire to. And as those values change, as we collectively start to question whether discomfort should be required for beauty, whether sacrifice should be necessary for status, whether the body should have to adapt to clothing rather than clothing adapting to the body, fashion will change too. It's already changing, slowly, unevenly, with plenty of resistance, but it's changing. And perhaps, someday, the title of this script, Why Most Luxury Fashion is Designed to be Uncomfortable, will seem strange, will seem like a relic of an earlier time when we accepted things that now seem obviously wrong. Perhaps someday, luxury will be defined by how well clothing serves the body, rather than by how much the body has to sacrifice for the clothing. Perhaps someday, the most expensive, most coveted garments will be the ones that feel best to wear, that enhance rather than constrain, that add to your life rather than demanding that you endure. Or perhaps not. Perhaps there will always be this tension, this complicated relationship between beauty and discomfort, between pleasure and pain, between what looks good and what feels good. Perhaps we'll always be drawn to clothing that challenges us, that demands something from us, that makes us aware of our bodies in new and sometimes uncomfortable ways. Either way, the conversation continues. Fashion continues. We continue, getting dressed every day, making choices about how to present ourselves to the world, negotiating the constant tension between who we are and who we want to appear to be, between the body that feels and the body that's seen. And maybe that's enough. Maybe there doesn't need to be a resolution, a final answer, a clear conclusion. Maybe it's enough to sit with the complexity, to acknowledge the contradictions, to recognize that fashion, like all human endeavors, is messy and ambiguous and means different things to different people in different moments. The discomfort of luxury fashion is real. The pleasure is also real. The oppression is real. The empowerment is also real. These things coexist, overlap, complicate each other. And we navigate them as best we can, making our own choices, finding our own balance, trying to create lives that feel authentic and meaningful and beautiful in whatever ways matter to us. And sometimes that means wearing uncomfortable shoes, And sometimes it means choosing comfort over convention. And sometimes it means something in between. Some careful negotiation between what you want to look like and what you want to feel like, between the demands of the world and the needs of your body. There's no final wisdom here, no ultimate truth to arrive at, just the ongoing, everyday practice of being human, of having a body, of moving through a world that has opinions about how that body should look and be presented. Just the constant, quiet negotiation between who you are and who you're expected to be, between what feels good and what looks good, between comfort and beauty and all the complicated territory between them. And luxury fashion, with all its discomfort and all its beauty, is just one part of that ongoing negotiation. One way of thinking about bodies and beauty and value and meaning. One possibility among many. One choice, however constrained or complicated that choice might be. In the endless series of choices that make up a life. So perhaps the question isn't why luxury fashion is designed to be uncomfortable. Perhaps the question is what we're looking for when we choose to wear it anyway, what we're hoping to find in that discomfort, what transformation or transcendence, or simply what moment of feeling like someone different, someone special, someone worthy of being looked at and remembered. Perhaps the question is what beauty means to us, what we're willing to sacrifice for it, and whether those sacrifices are ones we choose freely, or ones that are imposed on us by forces larger than ourselves. These are questions without easy answers, questions that each of us has to sit with, has to figure out for ourselves. Questions that change over time as we change, as culture changes, as fashion changes. Questions that will probably never be fully resolved because they touch on something fundamental about what it means to be human, to have a body, to exist in relation to others, to care about how we're seen and how we see ourselves. And so the conversation continues quietly in the early morning hours, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the moments when we're most honest with ourselves about what we want and what we're willing to endure to get it. The conversation continues, and fashion continues, and we continue, navigating this strange, beautiful, uncomfortable world as best we can, one garment at a time, one choice at a time, one moment of transformation or endurance, or simply of being present in our bodies in the world. And maybe that's all there is. Maybe that's enough. The ongoing conversation, the constant negotiation, the everyday practice of getting dressed and going out into the world and making choices about how to be seen and how to be. The discomfort and the beauty and everything in between. The pleasure and the pain and the complicated space where they overlap and become indistinguishable from each other. Luxury fashion, in all its uncomfortable glory, is just one expression of this ongoing negotiation, this endless exploration of what it means to have a body and what we're willing to do with it, to it, for it. And as long as we have bodies, as long as we care about beauty, as long as we exist in relation to others who see us and judge us and form opinions about us based on how we look, this negotiation will continue. The discomfort will continue. The beauty will continue. The complicated, ambiguous, deeply personal relationship between them will continue. And we'll keep getting dressed, keep making choices, keep trying to find that elusive balance between comfort and beauty, between who we are and who we want to be, between the body that feels and the body that's seen. And perhaps, in the end, that's what luxury fashion is really about. Not the garments themselves, but the space they create for this exploration, this questioning, this constant re-examination of what we value and why. The discomfort is just one part of that larger conversation. One way of marking certain moments as significant, certain choices as meaningful, certain transformations as worth the cost. Whether we agree with that valuation, whether we think the cost is worth paying, whether we choose to participate or opt out or find some middle ground, these are decisions we each make for ourselves, moment by moment, garment by garment, day by day. There's no judgment here, no right answer, no final conclusion, just the ongoing exploration, the constant questioning, the quiet conversation that continues long after the lights go out and the day ends and we finally take off those uncomfortable shoes and return to ourselves, to our bodies, to the simple, private pleasure of being comfortable again. And in that moment of relief, in that transition from performance to rest, from beauty to comfort, from the body that's seen to the body that simply is, perhaps we understand something essential about why luxury fashion persists, why we keep choosing it despite the discomfort, why the transformation matters even when the cost is high. Because the relief wouldn't feel so good if there hadn't been discomfort first. The comfort wouldn't feel so precious if we hadn't sacrificed it for a while. The simple pleasure of being in your body without constraint wouldn't be quite so sweet if you hadn't experienced what it's like to be constrained, to be shaped, to be transformed into something other than your natural self. Maybe that's the real luxury in the end. Not the garments themselves, not the discomfort they create, but the heightened awareness they bring, the appreciation for both transformation and return, for both beauty and comfort, for both the public self and the private self. The luxury of knowing that you can be both, that you can move between them, that you have the resources and the agency to make those choices for yourself. Or maybe that's too hopeful, too optimistic about what luxury fashion offers and who has access to its pleasures and its pains. Maybe the truth is simpler and sadder, that we endure discomfort because we've been taught to, because the alternative seems worse, because comfort has been coded as lazy or unsophisticated or not worth taking seriously. Maybe there's no great revelation here, no profound truth to arrive at. Maybe it's just what it looks like on the surface. Beautiful clothes that hurt to wear, and people who wear them anyway because beauty matters, and because pain, in small doses, in controlled contexts, for limited amounts of time, feels bearable, feels like something we can handle, feels like a price worth paying for whatever it is we think we're getting in return. And so, the night continues, and the thoughts continue, wandering and circling and never quite arriving anywhere definite. Just like fashion itself, just like beauty itself, just like the complicated relationship between our bodies and the world they move through. The questions remain open, the conversation remains unfinished, and somewhere, someone is putting on uncomfortable shoes and heading out into the world, carrying all of this with them, all this history and theory and ambivalence and desire, making it look easy even when it's not, performing effortlessness even though effort is all there is. And maybe that's the final thought. if there can be a final thought in a conversation that by its nature resists finality. Maybe it's simply this: we are all performing all the time, whether we're wearing luxury fashion or sweatpants, whether we're in pain or in comfort, whether we're conscious of the performance or not. Fashion just makes the performance more visible, more deliberate, more costly. It asks us to be aware of what we're doing, to make conscious choices about how we want to be seen, and what we're willing to sacrifice for that vision. And in that awareness, in that consciousness, there might be something valuable, something worth preserving even as we question and challenge and try to change the systems that have made discomfort seem necessary, seem inevitable, seem like the price we have to pay for beauty and status and belonging. Because at least when we're aware of the performance, when we're conscious of the choices we're making and the costs we're bearing, we have the possibility of choosing differently. We have the possibility of saying no, of opting out, of finding other ways to be beautiful that don't require suffering. We have the possibility of creating new standards, new definitions, new relationships between our bodies and the clothes we put on them. And that possibility, however distant, however difficult to achieve, is perhaps worth holding on to, worth thinking about, worth sitting with in these quiet hours when the world is still and the usual noise has faded, and we can hear ourselves think, can feel ourselves feel, can exist for a moment without the constant pressure to perform, to present, to be something other than what we simply are. The uncomfortable shoes will still be there in the morning. The restrictive dresses, the stiff jackets, the elaborate constructions that prioritize beauty over ease, they'll still be there, still be coveted, still be worn by people who find meaning in them, who find transformation in them, who find something worth having, even at the cost of comfort. And that's okay. That can be okay. As long as it's a choice, as long as there are alternatives, as long as we're not all trapped in the same narrow definition of what luxury means, what beauty means, what fashion means. As long as we can keep the conversation going, keep questioning, keep imagining other possibilities, keep making space for different kinds of bodies and different kinds of beauty and different ways of being in the world. The night is quiet now. The thoughts are settling. The conversation is winding down, not because it's finished, but because some things don't finish. They just pause, they rest, they wait to be picked up again. Another day, another night, another moment of wondering why we do the things we do, and what it all means, and whether there might be better ways of being. Luxury fashion will continue. Discomfort will continue. Beauty will continue. And so will we, navigating it all as best we can, making our choices, living with their consequences, trying to find moments of grace and pleasure and meaning in the complicated space between what we want and what we're willing to endure to get it. And perhaps that's enough. Perhaps that's all there is. The trying, the choosing, the ongoing negotiation between comfort and beauty, between body and image, between who we are in private and who we become in public. The shoes are by the door. The dress is hanging in the closet. Tomorrow, or the next day, or sometime soon, you'll put them on again, or you won't. You'll make a choice, or the choice will be made for you by circumstance, by expectation. by the context you find yourself in. And either way, you'll move through the world carrying this knowledge with you, this awareness of what fashion asks and what it gives, what it costs, and what it's worth. Carrying the history of corsets and heels and all the beautiful, uncomfortable things that people have worn across centuries, across cultures, across the endless human project of trying to transform ourselves into something we think is better, something we think is worth the pain. And maybe in that caring, in that awareness, in that continued questioning and choosing and negotiating, there's a kind of freedom. Not freedom from the constraints of fashion, or the demands of beauty, or the pressure to present ourselves in particular ways, but freedom within those constraints. Freedom to understand them, to see them clearly, to make conscious choices about how and when and whether to participate in them. Freedom to say yes when yes feels right, and no when no feels necessary, and maybe when maybe is all you can manage. Freedom to be complicated, to be contradictory, to love fashion and resent it, to find power in uncomfortable clothes and wish they didn't have to be uncomfortable. To understand the system and still choose to participate in it, or to step away from it, or to exist somewhere in between. Freedom to be human, which is always complicated, always contradictory, always more messy and ambiguous than any theory or explanation or 2-hour script can fully capture. And so, we rest here, in this quiet space, with no answers, but perhaps better questions, with no solutions, but perhaps deeper understanding, with no resolution, but perhaps greater awareness of what we're doing and why, and what it costs us, and what it gives us in return. The luxury fashion remains uncomfortable. We remain in complicated relationship with it. The body remains, feeling everything, enduring everything, carrying us through this strange and beautiful world in whatever clothes we choose to put on it. And the night grows late, and the thoughts grow soft, and the words wind down into silence, into rest, into the quiet space where questions don't need answers and contradictions don't need resolution. And we can simply be for a moment, without having to perform anything for anyone, without having to endure anything, without having to be beautiful or uncomfortable, or any of the things that the world usually asks of us. Just being, just breathing, just existing in our bodies, which are enough, which have always been enough, even when fashion has tried to tell us otherwise. And on that thought, quiet and simple and maybe a little bit hopeful, we'll let the conversation end, or pause, or simply fade into the darkness, waiting to be continued another day, in another voice, in another moment of wondering about beauty and discomfort, and all the complicated ways we try to make ourselves into something worth looking at.